Welcome to Presence, a global conversation for a new earth.
And hello, everybody, and welcome. I am Doug, and I am glad you are with us here for this final episode of Regeneration and all its elements, what it means, and taking a look, especially here as we wrap it up, about judgment. Judgment, which has been a foundational part of the interpretation of Christology as a religion, a foundational part of judging, a requirement of judging in order to separate the saved from the lost, the true believer from the apostate or heretic, those that are correctly doing this, believing that, doing this, doing that. So we're talking about judgment. And I'm wrapping it up today. Talked about many elements, but last week I said that I have been getting some emails, and that's great. And I appreciate it. And I appreciate everyone's views and sharing their views. After all, this is a conversation for a new earth. So I appreciate the conversation. And so in these emails that I've gotten, there have been these things that have been long time arguments for those who seek to hold on to the power of judging others. There are some go-to scriptures, verses. Not a lot of them, but all you need is one. Because if you're a person who craves the power of judgment over others, then you're looking for anything, even if it's just a verse, that justifies you being the one who has that power. And so some of the questions have been, well, what about those who are outside the gates of the New Jerusalem? What about blasphemy against the Holy Spirit? What about the unpardonable sin? What about Hitler and all these other people that we might go to in history or presently in the present who have committed horrible, evil actions? What about them? Well, let's go to the text, because I go to the text for everything. That's why I love reading and studying the biblical narrative. It's the foundation and guidepost for the way I get up every day and live my life in every aspect of it, and the way I relate to the rest of this world. So let's look at it. Let's go back to this narrative, and let's first of all summarize. As I get into these questions, let's just start with a kind of a summary, if you will, about what Paul was doing when he wrote a letter to the Gentiles in Rome. There was something that concerned him, and it was the fact that the Gentiles had a misunderstanding about the nature of their very own salvation and what they were doing with regard to judging. And it was something that Paul felt he needed to write a very substantial letter about. The question for Paul was always one of identity. And as he told the Galatians, and we have gone through many times, but again, I'm just going to set the stage before we go into these questions. Then I'm going to read more scripture from the narrative. Paul has said that identity is either after the flesh or after the spirit. And he used the story of Abraham's two sons to serve as what he said was an allegory. So that's the way he was going to explain identity. For Paul, identity was a matter of genealogy. Okay, now we have two genealogies. We're into regenealogizing, regenerating. Ishmael was the biological, genealogical son that came through Hagar. Isaac was the biological son who came through Sarah. But that birth was different genealogically because the source of that genealogy was spirit. Isaac is born of spirit, not by Abraham through selfish source as he did with Hagar, but rather through God as source, who gave life to the deadness of Sarah's womb. Genealogy initially began in the realm of form. Forms have boundaries by which things are identified so that things are either inclusive or exclusive of the boundaries related to that identity. Ishmael excluded the biological boundaries of inheritance. He's in that world of form. And so his biological source or mother genealogically excluded him from the concept of inheritance. And so with regard to Hagar, Paul said, she is not our mother. Okay, Paul's saying that's not our genealogy. She's not our mother. Now, Isaac, on the other hand, was the son of Sarah. And within the genealogical boundaries of that world, and under the laws which adjudicated those boundaries, Isaac was the legitimate heir. Therefore, Paul said, she is our mother. Mother, again, is a term of source, just like father. You'll see Jesus say father, Paul says mother. We know God is transcendent of all gender identification. But mother for Paul is used as source, and we're going to get into this idea of mother even more when we answer some of the questions you've sent me. So we know, as we've said, the law can only exist in the realm of form because the boundaries of any form have to be judged to make sure we're either within or outside the boundaries. And we might say, for example, to determine whether somebody is innocent or guilty. Taking this to religion or Christianity being a form, we would then need to know, are you obedient or disobedient? Which would lead us to be able to say whether you're saved or lost. We are using Christology as a new form. It's just another way of determining who's in and who's out. So it's really identical to the first creation. So in this case, the law said that Ishmael was excluded, and in that sense, he was cast out. As a matter of fact, Paul said, cast out the woman of bondage, the bondwoman. This is how identity is determined under law. It is an either-or outcome. And you know, I thought about this the other day, and I thought, isn't it interesting that in our country right now, here in the U.S., there are thousands of people today in courtrooms. Thousands. And in that courtroom, there are two attorneys, and they're going to argue against each other regarding guilt or innocence. It will be the same incident. It will be using the same law, but they will argue about its interpretation. And so I might ask the question here, does Christianity ever manifest arguing? Do Christians argue among each other? So what happens in a courtroom of humans? Well, sometimes it's a jury who actually ends up in what we call a hung jury because those 12 can't actually decide amongst themselves. They disagree, and you can't come to a conclusion, so it's a hung jury because those human beings could not agree in their judgment. And sometimes even worse, you'll see a TV show about someone that's been in prison for many years because the entire jury got it wrong. That's human beings. We get it wrong. And remember, the narrative in the first creation was that which was subjected to a bondage of law. And what happens? the Hebrew writer says, that system, that covenant, that way of understanding either or, judgment thinking, led to the statement of God for finding fault with the people. So Christians are not only proclaiming identity based on judgment and on some form of casting out, but what's worse, they can't even agree on what it is, using the very same narrative. They're like attorneys in the courtroom that go at each other every day and argue between themselves denominationally. The birth of Isaac transcended the realm of form. His birth came from that which is beyond form, meaning that which is formless. Spirit is formless. God was the source. And Paul is saying, Spirit, she is our mother. And so the identity of the Spirit and identity after the Spirit is this genealogy beyond the human and human doing. So I've summarized all of this to say that clearly in the story, there are only two identities. All right. Let's think now about the law as the way. The law was the way God found all under disobedience. Under God's reconciliatory work in Christ, Christ is the way by which God has mercy upon all. The law is the way, all are found under disobedience. Christ is the way by which God has mercy upon all. Christ is God's way of regeneration, of regenealogizing, and bringing into being a brand new creation, new heaven and earth. New world, meaning a new paradigm and way of seeing, a higher way of seeing. Now, Christianity, the institution, is the way to the Father religiously. But dying to form, dying to self, dying to doing, is the way to the Father, says Jesus. The way after the Spirit is to die to doing. And this is why Paul says to the Gentiles, this is why all Israel's saved. You are judging them on a paradigm of either or, where you, first of all, declare that you have a righteousness of your own, i.e., you're saying you are part of the saved, and you are then condemning all others that you have interpreted through self as source to not be of God identity. So, looking at these questions, setting this up then, okay, we've set up the two paradigms, we're looking at this, let's think even further. What about those outside the gates of the New Jerusalem? Let's start there. What about those? Okay, so going back to Paul, we started with Galatians 4 and Hagar and Sarah. Paul is using two women as metaphors for identity, meaning source of identity. Two women. Okay. We go to John's Revelation. And in the 12th chapter of that Revelation, John sees a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet. This is Paul's metaphor of Sarah as the woman who had Isaac after the Spirit. John is seeing, by the way, the same two women. Why? Because this is the story. This is the God story. It's about source. It's about which woman. Which woman is the mother? Which woman is the source of genealogy? And what an amazing picture of this woman being clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet. Here you see that the moon is that which rules in the night. And that's a metaphor for that initial first world creation. It was under the night because in that sense they were in darkness. They were under the bondage of darkness. And that's why Paul said, we need to understand your salvation is nearer than when you first believed. The night is far past, the day is at hand. Here we have night and day used again for the two creations being regenerated. And so the sun and the moon are restored to proper functions. The moon is glorious, but the sun is more glorious. In fact, we only see the moon because of the sun. That sounds a lot like spiral dynamics. They are part of one seamless story. They play a role in our lives today that is seamless, both the moon and the sun. God did not cast out the moon. So now, let's move over to Revelation 17 and 18. John sees a second woman. This woman, not so good. She is described as a fornicator, unfaithful, and John uses the name Babylon as a metaphor for a woman who genders to bondage. Babylon was, in Israel's history, Babylon was the one who came in 586 BC and destroyed her temple at that time. It had to be rebuilt, but and then took Israel into what? Into bondage. Exiled Israel into bondage. So this name Babylon is perfect for the first world creation. And when you roll over to chapter 18 here, looking at that, down here in verses 4 and 5, here's what's being said. Come out of her, my people. Come out of this one. There's two women. Come out of her, this Babylon, so you do not share in her sins, because her sins have reached to heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. Now remember about the first creation and what Paul said to the Thessalonians. Remember what was happening in this first century. Sin was being revealed at its apex. This is why Paul said to the Thessalonians that Israel was filling up the measure of sin. It was being brought to its fullest measure. Her sins, says John, same thing, have reached the heaven. It's filling up its measure. That was necessary for it to go to its strongest point in order for the deliverer to come and knock it down at its strongest point, when it stood as Goliath at its strongest point. So there's your two women. And these two women are the two Jerusalems. And in John's revelation, see, he's painting a picture of the way things are standing initially. That second woman is still there when he paints its picture. Those outside the gates of the New Jerusalem are still there when he begins to paint the picture. The two Jerusalem, therefore, represent not just the two creations, but two covenants. Paul's conclusion to the Gentile was that God's final act of coming from Zion, which is the space of the New Jerusalem, is a time when God declares through the prophets, this is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. So first their sins are brought to an apex, then the deliverer comes at the time when they are in hopeless bondage to that sin and takes it away by removing that which is behind sin. And that which is behind sin is the attempt of the human to do God identity. It can't be done. Hebrews chapter 8 is even more specific, because there, this coming of the new creation with a new covenant, the writer is saying, quoting God in this case, for I will be merciful. Remember Paul? He's found all under disobedience that he might be merciful to all. I will be merciful to their unrighteousness and their sins, and those iniquities we talk about in Revelation, and their iniquities I will remember no more. This is a story. God is telling us a story about our nature, what it is and what it isn't. Our nature is it flows with the energy of spirit, and our nature when we resist spirit. John showing the final God action of removal in order for acceptance to be the end of the story. Just as we see the presence of two women, we also see the presence of two Jerusalems. The first Jerusalem is consisted of all those who are outside the gates of the New Jerusalem. That's a casting out process, but it precedes the accepting process. John uses in his book of Revelation the metaphor of fire. What is being cast into fire? It's the same as darkness, as being cast into darkness. It's why Jesus used the parable of the tares and said that the tares were cast into the fire. It's removal. It's a process of removal. This is the way enlightenment comes. Jesus said, don't put your light under a basket, under a form. Remove the form so that it will reveal your light. The form is not your identity. The form is that which is preventing you from seeing your true identity. So this is God's manner of reconciliation and restoration. And just as the woman of bondage falls, and this is that great fall of Babylon. Oh, the great fall of Babylon, how the mighty have fallen. Babylon falls. And this is the predicament of those found outside the New Jerusalem. God finds them outside that New Jerusalem. He finds them under disobedience, that he might have mercy upon all. This goes back to the very beginning when God finds Adam. He found Adam under disobedience. He has found all under disobedience. And that is necessary to the process of restoration and reconciliation. It's necessary. The human ego shown in Adam and his waking up experience in infancy of the human story of growth and evolution, in that egoic state, Adam craved power. And the power he craved was the knowledge of good and evil. Because once you have that knowledge, you can stand up and say, guess what? I belong into the form called good, and here are all the people that belong in the form called evil, for I have the knowledge of good and evil. I've been able to do what Adam could not. So, when we talk about blasphemy against the Holy Spirit, to blaspheme against the Spirit is to leave the identity after the Spirit and return to the identity after the flesh. It's going back into that. That would be to blaspheme the Spirit, would be to leave it and to go back into the first identity. And this was part of the world-changing revelation of the first century that was necessary to tell me the story and explain the story. This is where those antichrists appear. What is it that John, same John who wrote Revelation, what is it he said about the antichrists? They went out from us. Their return was to a paradigm of sin. That was blaspheming the identity after the Spirit. This return to the paradigm of sin would never bring forgiveness, therefore it was unpardonable. You cannot find forgiveness when you practice go back into this world of doing. To do so would be blasphemy against that which was after the Spirit. And it is in this way, with the Antichrist, etc., that sin reaches its apex, comes to fulfillment, fills up the cup of iniquity, etc. But only so. once having been revealed for what it was, God the deliverer could then free us from the bondage of requirements and doing. The fulfilled work of God removed the first creation. It doesn't exist anymore. Sin and death are defeated. All nations, I emphasize all, just like Paul emphasized all, so John, all nations walk in the light of the New Jerusalem, because we've all been delivered from the bondage of the first. There is no second woman today. Babylon has fallen. It's done. It's finished. That creation is gone. It is the only place that sin and death can exist. So when that New Jerusalem came down, John said, and then the presence of God dwelt with humanity. That's our nonprofit verse, the presence of God. That's what presence to us is. It's the all-in-all awareness of God, God's interconnectivity with all, in the quantum world, in the biological world, and in the world of human spiritual identity. So when we talk about the desire to hold on to judgment power, when people are looking, I got to find some way to say, well, of course we must judge. That's when they go to this final one. What about Hitler? What about this? What about that? For one thing, when we're talking in judgment language, when we question specific people and desire to label that person in the box called evil, we're showing an inability to distinguish between an evil act and an identity of evil. When Jesus said, "Forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing," he was talking about an evil act they were committing, murder on a cross, to the one who was sent to them by God as an act, an acting out, an evil acting out that came from unconsciousness of their true identity. God restores Paul. Paul was in complete agreement with all the people that had called for Jesus to be crucified. We know this because he then went after all the followers of Jesus. He was there when Stephen was stoned to death. He was seeking to persecute as many as he could when he was found on the road to Damascus. Are we going to distinguish between these people in history from people that are in our more current history and say, well, that's different? God's answer was never to destroy his children, but rather to remove that which had blinded his children. God was a God of revealing, awareness, enlightenment, for the purpose of restoring, not destroying. It's the human acting out from the killing instinct that wants to destroy. It's that instinct that wants to see eternal punishment. But this leaves the question, well, how would that be done, though? How would God restore, this, and this? They wondered about that with Saul. I mean, they didn't want to go near him for a while because they knew his identity had been one Saul of Tarsus, the killer. And it took him a while to feel safe around him. But his identity in his own mind had changed. So this asks the question, we ask the question, but how? How does God restore? I have said we know that God restores because the narrative talks about that God restores. But what does the narrative tell us about how God does things? How the darkness of Paul's blindness was removed? How does it happen? And this is where I'll conclude with this series by the problem of how, and the desire of the instinctive ego to take the power of how things happen and how judgment should occur. And this is the conclusion that Paul gave. This is Paul, And his conclusion to the Gentiles, after all the things we've discussed in this series and everything that he said to them, his conclusion was not, "Oh, when I look out the window today, I see an evil, terrible world. Oh my goodness, there's chaos everywhere. Everything is in ruins." Yes, those kinds of things do exist. When you enter into a new land, it is true there will be giants in the land. And it's true that most people will see giants in the land and say we're doomed. And they will live under that philosophy. We're doomed. All I see is giants in the land. That's because they're attempting to search out through selfish source. But Paul was excited about this conclusion about God. He was excited because he says, "Oh, the depth of the riches of the wisdom and knowledge of God." Then Paul talks about the how. Well, how would God do this? How would God restore this person? How would God do this? Paul addresses the how. How unsearchable are his judgments and his ways past finding out. There's your conclusion, Gentiles, when you're sitting there saying, "But how could Israel be saved? How could this person be saved? How could this person be restored?" Here's the how. How unsearchable. Going back to Adam, how unsearchable are what? His judgments. This whole thing has been about judgment. Well, you know what God's judgments are? They're unsearchable. And his ways past finding out, and this is what Adam so badly wanted to do, was to take that power of good and evil and then go around and tell everyone the way that judgment should fall. The way you should be judged, the way your kids should be judged, the way your grandchildren should be judged, and your neighbors. And it won't matter what they do or what kind of people they are. It'll only matter whether or not they are a Christian in the appropriate and proper denomination. But Paul says to the Gentiles, "For who has known the mind of God? Who has become God's counselor? Or who has first given to God that it should be repaid to him?" Paul is saying there's a lesson in humility coming for humanity. And it's not because God is trying to be mean to anybody. God is always trying to help his children and move them forward. I don't sit here and say what I say because I've done something you haven't. I'm saying I'm the same as you. I'm saying my identity comes from the same source that your identity comes from. And so that's the difference. You know, one last thing I'll say that I find very fascinating about the way Paul ends his talk to the Gentiles is in this chapter in 14, Romans 14, as he's ending his letter. He makes this statement to them. "Who are you to judge another servant?" Ooh, think about that. Who are you to judge another servant? Now, we know now why Paul would say that to these Gentiles, right? Because that's what they were doing. They were trying to determine salvation. And they were making it either or, just like in the first creation under law, and that you have to meet some requirements. You even have to meet certain requirements to get grace so that you can be forgiven for the things you do. But you have to do the right thing to get the grace so you're forgiven of the things you do. That's the Gentile problem. And he says, "Who are you to judge another servant? To his own master he stands or falls." Have they fallen that they should never be restored, said Paul in 9 through 11? God forbid. To his own master he stands or falls. But here's the conclusion. Indeed, he will be made to stand, for God is able to make him stand. Wow. I'm going to leave that to God. I'm going to leave the how to God. I'm not looking for some way to judge you or my neighbor. I'm spending my life in the biblical narrative trying to figure out how I can change me. I'm the problem. Self is the problem. And the more I find ways to seek change within, the more I'm finding my relationships getting better and better, and my life getting better and better. This is the new conversation that is now coming to the world stage. You'll hear more about it later, but now more and more people are talking about it, and believe me, a big change is coming in this conversation that we've just had. A big change. A big change in the way people even think about, and define religion itself. So we got more to come, but this is the last episode for this series, and it is now June when I record this. Danae and I are traveling in June. We're traveling in July. I'll be back as we head towards the fall. When you see all those signs in front of the school building saying, "Welcome back," I'll be back. In the meantime, you may get some newsletters talking about some great new opportunities that Presence is engaged in. I don't know when they'll be for public announcement, but there are things going on right now that I'm doing and working with others on that we will be announcing. And they're great because they're about this great new conversation. And I'm so glad that you all have taken the time to join us and be part of this conversation for the new earth in which we live. Have a great week out there. We'll see you soon.
Thank you for joining us today. If you have any questions or comments, please contact us at info@presence.tv. You can also visit our website at presence.tv or find us on Facebook. We look forward to hearing from you.